Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
Our special guest for Public Affairs Roundtable today is Betty Friedan, feminist, founder of the National Organization for Women, author of 3 books, including The Feminine Mystique, lecturer and leader of the women's movement in the United States. Joining us also today is Leslie Kaplan, assistant professor for psychological sciences at Ball State, who also chairs the Women's Studies Committee, and John Rouse from the Department of Political Science here at Ball State University. Betty Friedan, welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable. I mentioned at the top of the show here that you're a lecturer, among your many other titles. What is the message that you bring? For example, you're lecturing in Muncie. What is the message you bring in your lectures, and how has it evolved over the last 5 or 10 years?
Well, I'm certainly not saying the same thing that I said 10 years ago. We've come, well, if you think even in terms of 20 years, we've come enormously far in terms of the very consciousness of women. Women are people. Women, it's assumed that they have equal opportunities, that they can be what they want to be, the young women, that they have choice, that there's a sense of freedom, of aliveness, of complexity open to you in your life as a woman. And they are taken seriously, and they take themselves seriously, and this is wonderful. And we had something to do with it, and it's a, you know, we were talking coming in the car, some of the younger now women here in Indiana came to pick me up at Indianapolis, and we said, they said, and I say it the same thing, this is the, you know, it is the biggest thing of our lives that we were a part of this movement, that we made this change happen. And you know, it's not, there are not many people, men, and certainly not many women, that can have had the sense that we have had of really changing history and of opening history for future generations. However, and that's what I'm going to be talking about here in Muncie, we're facing a kind of a crisis now, and it isn't really seen for the crisis it is. I think that the women's movement has been almost paralyzed by fundamentalist backlash. That the laws have been that we won, and sex discrimination in employment, education, credit, the executive orders on affirmative action with where institutions or companies have government contracts, the right to decide when and whether to have and how many children to have, and to have access and choice of birth control, family planning, and legal access to abortion. All of these things are being taken away. And the fundamentalist church groups have, in effect, declared war on women's rights and women's choice. And the Reagan administration is moving in Congress and in executive orders and in the administrative departments and in the courts to take these rights away. Right now, Attorney General Meese is trying to get rid of the executive order that on government contracts, saying that if a company or an institution is guilty of sex discrimination and doesn't take affirmative action to end it, that they will lose a government contract. And that was one of the first weapons we won when we started now, nearly 20 years ago. And now that's being taken away. And the yuppies, the young women, the women I'll be talking to tonight, the yuppies that we created, you know, with these professions and so on, they take it all for granted. They say, I'm not a feminist, but I take it for granted that I can be an astronaut or a
complacency that, in fact, we've come this far. How far much further can we go?
Right, and then there's the other thing too, is that we're not even finished. Even first of all, we have to defend the rights that we thought we'd won 10 years ago, and that is absolutely essential. But second, there are a whole set of new problems that the yuppies, they may not face them while they're still in school, but they're going to face them as soon as they start having kids. That they're in male-structured jobs and professions, and they can't have it all unless they do something about changing the structure of those jobs and professions and getting some new social programs and innovations on childcare. And they're just seeing their problems as personal. They're becoming as isolated in their way as the frustrated suburban housewives that I interviewed over 20 years ago for the Feminine Mystique.
Well, I was going to raise the question that it seems to me that the women's movement has moved from the political stage to the economic stage, but you're saying really that the political rights are still in jeopardy.
Well, you are not going to have the economic wherewithal if you lose the political rights. In other words, those laws on sex discrimination in employment and education, and the class action suits, and the statistics that were used and the executive orders on affirmative action, those open the doors that those yuppies take for granted. The class action suits are what open the doors for women in the broadcasting networks, in the law firms, and in crucial positions in universities and corporations. With the abandonment of these tools, which is of enforcement, which is what the Reagan administration is doing, given the slightest economic downturn, and those doors that the young women take for granted are not going to be open.
Well, if I could follow up quickly, you wrote of the feminine mystique in the 1960s. How is the feminine mystique of the 1980s different from the 1960s?
Well, I also wrote a book in the early 1980s called The Second Stage. And the women's movement, I mean, we don't have this, we have moved beyond the feminine mystique of the 1960s. We do not see a woman anymore just as a housewife, just as a mother, just in terms of her sexual relation to man. We do see her as a person. However, there are some new mystiques in a way. The mystique of having it all, which is a myth. It's not true. It's not true for most women unless we continue the job, what I call the second stage, of restructuring jobs, job training, professional training, hours of work, conditions of work, and a new role, and more consciousness to a new role for men as well as women, in equally shared childcare, and new innovations and new programs in childcare. Otherwise, you have a superwoman mystique. You have having it all. Then there are illusions of equality that don't yet exist in divorce, for instance. I mean, we don't want to see women defined just as housewives any longer, but in the second stage, we have to recognize that there is no possibility of equality for women just on a male model, and that there has to be a real value put on the work that women used to do for nothing in the home and for less pay than it was worth outside the home. So you have second stage economic demands of equal pay for work of comparable value, which is called comparable worth or pay equity. I don't know if you've got that yet in Indiana, but it's certainly a need if you don't. Then you also have to have something in the divorce law, where there has to be, if there is a divorce, a division of property that recognizes the work of the contribution of the woman who may have spent many years as either mostly or primarily as a housewife, taking responsibility for home and children and helping to build up the assets that not only the home, but entitlement to pension and health insurance and the like, which she should be equally entitled to, and the law doesn't say that yet. I mean, we have a whole lot of problems that have to be faced that are not solved.
I'd like to go back to the way you opened in pointing out that recently there's been a backlash against the feminist movement. It seems to me that a lot of times when people make that point and when people are attacking feminism, a major component of their argument is the idea that feminism is anti-family, or that women who work outside the home are responsible for the breakdown of the American family. And what do you think?
Well, first of all, to read my book, The Second Stage. Or you can also even read It Changed My Life, which was a book I wrote about 10 years ago that has just been reissued by Norton, where you'll see, first of all, my articulation of feminist concept, which, not that I speak for all feminists, but I think that I did have something to do in articulating the visions for the mainstream of the feminist movement, was never anti-family. Never anti-family. It was a break, and originally we had to break through the feminine mystique, which defined women solely in terms of family, and say that women are people also that move in society, and we need to have equal opportunity in society. But I saw even in the feminine mystique that the either-or kind of thing was one of the major things that held women back or pushed women back. And in the second stage, I articulated even more precisely that feminism, far from being opposed to the family, it strengthens the family, but it also implies a new gestalt for the family, new role for man as well as woman, and that there have to be the new terms worked out. I agree with you that the media image, the bra-burning image, paint, and also fed by some extremism in the women's movement itself, tried to paint feminism as anti-family, and I feel that in what I call the second stage, that in fact the movement has got to address themselves very sharply to some questions that really do affect family. I mean, such as parental leave, and maternity and paternity leave, and flex time that make it more possible for women or mother or father to combine the early child-rearing years with their professional work or with jobs, and new kinds of child care, and even new kinds of housing for that matter. But the women's movement hasn't, I mean, I really can't blame them in a way. They haven't moved to this kind of second stage thinking because the energies have been so taken up defending the rights that we thought we had won 10 years ago.
You mentioned the media image, and I think about the media coverage of women's issues. When the Equal Rights Amendment was alive and well and growing and coming within a few states of becoming part of the Constitution of the United States, women's issues had a lot of attention from the media. Has the demise then of the ERA really hurt the movement, drawing attention to women's issues?
By the way, I have to say that I'm happy to be in Indiana, which was the last state to ratify the ERA, and every month this year we have reason to bemoan and bewail that we did not get the Equal Rights Amendment into the Constitution, because they said, remember they said you don't need the Equal Rights Amendment because you've got all these laws on sex discrimination and employment, education.
Go to court. Sure.
Go to court. Well, the laws are being taken away by the Reagan administration, and the judges that Reagan is appointing are interpreting the Constitution in a way that says the women don't have these rights. So we can see how much we needed the ERA. It wasn't just the defeat of ERA. It was certainly a basic part and result of the backlash, and the backlash has been bad for women. As for the media, however, I have to say that the media, in a way, the image of women has been transformed by the women's movement. And for one thing, there are more women in active roles now in television, in radio than before. I just did an interview for your public service radio. The news director was a woman. I was happy to see that, the active participation of women as not only newsmakers, but news broadcasters. This is important. If you see the image of women on television, I mean, there you have a very interesting reflection of the more complex reality of women's lives today. It used to be there were no parts for actresses, just waving goodbye, or sort of dumb sex object, or, frantically trying to get the shirt clean or the sink clean in the commercials. Well, now, it may not be great art, but when you have women detectives and women police persons and single parents and doctors and lawyers and news women and there's a richer, more various image.
This seems to be such a contrast because on one hand you say that the laws are disappearing, but yet you're giving examples of various roles of women. I'm not sure I follow you in terms of what laws are not here now that were here several years ago.
They are being eroded. They are being eroded. And there is an attempt to gut them out of existence, without even necessarily taking it to Congress, but by administrative order. Or, for instance, absolutely, there are four different laws or rulings that were absolutely essential to the freedom, to the complexity that is reflected by this richer image of women today, and that makes lives of women so much better. There was the law, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, on outlawing sex discrimination in employment. There was a law, Title IX, on sex discrimination in education. There was Title VI that involved access to family planning. I think that was, isn't that Title VI? Well, anyway. And then there was a Supreme Court decision, Roe versus Wade. And then there were the mechanisms for enforcing these laws. Then there was the executive order on sex discrimination and affirmative action in under government contract, for institutions, corporation, and government contract. And enforcing these laws and implementing these laws were class action suits, use of statistics, etc. The Justice Department meets the EEOC that administers the law has been saying, no class action suits, that you'll have to prove, and the courts, like Grove City court decision, you have to prove individual discrimination each time. You have to, the whole athletic programs, for instance, why are these wonderful new array of women champions, women athletes, this whole new confidence that women get because they are getting the athletic training, the boys, and that they are seen in these active roles in sports. This Grove City court decision says that you cannot any longer point to the law on sex discrimination if, for instance, Ball State didn't have as good athletic training programs, physical training programs for girls as for boys. If it used to be, you would say, well, take affirmative action to change that at once if this were so, because you do get government contracts here. But now they will say, no, you don't, unless the government was giving you the basketballs. You don't have to worry that your basketball program isn't open to women. Do you see what I mean? In other words, they are whittling away the coverage of the law. They're saying we shouldn't use statistics anymore. And they're even making appointments to the EEOC or the Civil Rights Commission to say, we should, with a directive, you should restore the balance of the white male, as it were. I mean, it's as if the word is going out from Washington. You don't have to worry anymore about undoing the inequities, the discrimination against women and against blacks. And once that word goes out, of course, individual law firms, individual companies, individual universities have discovered that the women they've hired and promoted and so on are enormously able. And some of them will continue to promote and hire women because they are enormously able. But given an economic downturn, the prejudices that still exist, it's not safe.
If I could follow up on the question, how important has affirmative action been for women in this country?
I think that you have to say it's important. I mean, in this period, for instance, where you got the laws on sex discrimination, where you got the affirmative action programs, and where you got the consciousness that the women's movement brought about and that was embodied in these laws, and which is chicken, which is egg. It's all one thing. In this period, women went from 2-3% of the law school class to 30 and 40%, from 2 and 3% of the medical school class to 30 and 40%. Jobs that were never open to women before, professional training that was never open to women before, was open to women. And this happened. And it clearly happened, and we know it in many instances. We know that there were companies, for instance, there were news magazines in New York where women could, no matter how able they were, could never get beyond the job of researcher. They might write the whole article, but it was the man's byline. That's my field, so I'm aware of that. As the writer, as the editor, as a result of a class action suit, now women can be writers, editors, as well as researchers. It wouldn't have happened without the class action suit, and then other companies, the threat of the class action suit. Whether those doors will remain open without that weapon anymore is anybody's guess. But you could almost assume it might remain open for a while if there's no economic pressure. But the minute you begin to get a rocky economic situation, it might be another story. And what the women tell me themselves is, there's a whole new networks, new girl networks, like the old boy networks, and these networks have women executives, women in the corporations, women's forums, women in the profession. I have a woman tell me she's got a job in an insurance company where 10 years ago no woman would have had such a job. She said, if my job became open today, they wouldn't look for a woman to fill it. Not because I haven't done a good job. They keep promoting me. They give me raises. But the word has gone out from Washington. You don't have to bother about looking for women anymore, blacks anymore. And that word has gone out. And so they're not going to bother. I mean, the old boy network is still pretty strong. And we needed these laws. We need these laws. We shouldn't allow them to be weakened. And I think that the organizations of the women's movement, like now, like the Women's Political Caucus, and the organizations that were the old volunteer organizations that in fact have been strengthened by the women's movement, like the League of Women Voters or the American Association of University Women or the Business and Professional Women and the like, the labor union women, the church groups, have got to join together to save these laws and invoke also the new professional networks of women, which have been concentrating on how you get into the executive suite. But the road even below the executive suite isn't going to be open if these laws are weakened further.
Leslie Kaplan?
I'd kind of like to change the tone of it a little bit. You spent part of this last summer in Nairobi as an official delegate to the...
Not an official delegate.
You weren't official.
I was a delegate at the non-governmental conference.
Okay.
And then I was in press at the official conference.
Okay, so there was this UN conference in Nairobi, and there was a non-governmental forum that ran in parallel with it. And the kinds of issues that came up were women's problems from an international sort of perspective. I wonder if you could pick the problems that seem to you to be the most pressing to describe them, and also what you think the U.S. role should be in dealing with those kinds of things.
There was an amazing commonality of the problems of women throughout. For one thing, what I just said about the laws and the rights, it was clear. I mean, it was clear, for instance, at Nairobi, compared to 10 years ago, Mexico, 5 years ago, in Copenhagen, that the women, the whole world, have been moving, that what began here 20 years ago is now a worldwide phenomenon, the women's movement, and the women's movement, in effect, is a world power. That the existence of the rights and the laws is extremely important. We heard this from Brazil, we heard that Latin Americans, we heard it from Africans, so on. That the women knowing they have rights, and women now have legal equal rights with men in all but 3 countries of the world. That this is enormously important. It's also important the need of women to earn is worldwide, and how you're going to earn and also do your responsibility to your children. That's a worldwide problem. The need of women to control their reproductive process is worldwide. The conditions are different for a yuppie in America and a woman in Kenya, but the need to have that control of your reproductive process. The being pushed back by the fundamentalists is happening to women in every religion. The sense of women everywhere that they want the opportunities and they have to move in man's world and have these jobs, but they don't want to lose their values and strengths as women. And that also that women's rights can only go so far, and if a nation's resources are all being devoted to war or to nuclear missile buildup, and that women have to have a voice in stopping that too.
Okay, so it extends beyond the family, the basic concerns.
Well, yes, of course.
Okay.
Will we in our lifetimes see equality of the sexes? True equality?
True equality.
In the job place?
Well, now, you see...
What is true equality? What's the goal?
What I say in the second stage is, you can't have true equality only on a male model. And for instance, you can't have true equality in the job place unless you have a restructuring of jobs and you have an equal role of men in the home. You see, so that true equality, we already have a sense of a more complex definition. And we're not even yet that close to just simple economic equality in the job place as well, because women are still in this country only 62 cents on the dollar for every dollar that men earn. And I think that in our lifetime we might see it, but that means that the young women that are saying I'm not a feminist but have got to start saying I am a feminist and move into the second stage.
Well, now what is a feminist?
Feminist, well, we all have our definition of that, and I say feminism is pluralism too. That it takes a different form at a different time in different situations. But my definition of feminism is that it is the movement of women to full equality, to true equality, to have their own voice and their own participation in the mainstream of society, and it is a explication. and an affirmation of values that come from female experience in every discipline, in every profession, in every part of society, an affirmation of the principles and values that have so far been limited to female experience by men. That's what I think.
Can this sort of, the pursuit of these goals, this goal, be accomplished, can we progress that way without the sympathy of an administration in Washington? Or do you have to vote that
At
way?
the moment, we certainly do not, I think, have the sympathy of the administration in Washington. We have the actual opposition of the administration in Washington. On the other hand, what we can see in Nairobi, and we can see even today in Washington, is that Republican women, identify more than we, they do identify as feminists. I mean, one of the reasons I think they got rid of Margaret Heckler was that Margaret Heckler did not approve of getting rid of the executive order on sex discrimination. Margaret Heckler had a lot to do, incidentally, with getting really good legislation on enforcement of child support, on collection of child support. And even I understand that Elizabeth Dole does not approve of Mises trying to get rid of the affirmative action. And Maureen Reagan and the other Republican women at Nairobi were really fighting very hard for the forward-looking strategies on equality, some of which included things like pay equity, equal pay for work of comparable value, that the Reagan administration is not for. So when you have an administration like Reagan in Washington that is listening too much to the fundamentalists that are opposed to women, then you have to have a women's underground. And that's what I think we're beginning to have. In this country, we not only have the open women's movement, but we're having underground again in Washington.
Thank you, Betty Friedan, for being with us today on Public Affairs Roundtable. I'd like also to thank Leslie Kaplan and John Rouse for their participation. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for being with us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Cecil Bohannon and Bill Mosier. This program is a production of University Media Services, the Department of Political Science, and radio and television stations on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.